Yo, what's going on everybody? This is Brendan back again for another video, and in today's video I have something very special. This video is going to be all about the different types of composition that you can use to frame up your shots, all sorts of different types of techniques for your cinematic repertoire. I'm really excited about today's episode because this is pulled directly from one of the chapters in my brand new book that I just published, the Cinematographer's Handbook. You can get it on Amazon right now as a paperback. I've been working on this book for the last 2 years now, so I'm really excited about it. It's been a labor of love, and it's a 140-page book that's directed towards aspiring cinematographers that are trying to learn everything that there is to know to start a really successful career in the film industry as a cinematographer. Today's episode, like I said, is all about the rules of composition. It's the entire second chapter of my book, so if you like what's in this video, then you'll like what's in the rest of the book. So let's get started. So besides just arbitrarily deciding how to compose an image, there are a few rules that you can actually follow to make sure you get a perfect composition every time. A good composition is all about balancing the image out. So different parts of an image have different values or weight depending on their geometric properties, like the size and the relationship of the different parts of the image. Color contrast and lighting contrast also affect this balance, but those are covered in a different chapter. So these aspects affect where the eye is drawn and what just feels right. By far the most common rule of composition is the rule of thirds. You might have heard this before. You basically see it everywhere because it has a really uncanny ability to create a feeling of balance in the frame. So the rule states that if you split the frame into thirds vertically and horizontally, you'll create 4 intersecting points at which you should place your focal point. So oftentimes the horizon is placed on one of the horizontal thirds, and this rule of composition works especially well in dialogue scenes, where you can place each person's face in the top left or the top right third, depending on where they're blocked in the scene and the direction they're looking. The second rule of composition is called the golden ratio, otherwise known as the Fibonacci symbol. It's a mathematical ratio that describes many organic shapes actually found in nature. So it describes everything from the proportions of the human body itself to the complex fractals found in the veins of a leaf or the swirl of a seashell. You can lay this symbol over your frame and try to create a composition in your scene that lines up with the symbol itself. So this trick creates results similar to the rule of thirds, but things don't line up at the exact thirds of the frame. By doing this though, you'll create a really well-balanced feeling. It feels very natural and proportional, and the amazing thing to me is that since we see this ratio everywhere in nature, it's almost like second nature to us as humans. It's ingrained in our minds subconsciously. So using this rule sort of accesses a deeper, more psychological response in your audience. And if that's not movie magic, then I don't know what is. So the next rule is what I call the rule of quadrants. Despite this being a really simple rule, it's actually not quite as common as some of the others. You basically just split the frame into 4 equal quadrants, and you place the subject in the middle of one of them or fill the entire quadrant with your subject. So this technique was used really masterfully in the film Drive in 2011 by Newton Thomas Sigel, ASC. He used this technique to create negative space in the frame in order to isolate his characters while still making the image feel balanced. So it can be used in any number of creative ways to evoke different feelings. So in this example here, the rule of quadrants highlights the juxtaposition between the actor on the left and that empty chair on the right. Particularly in this scene in the storyline, their son just stormed out on them after a big fight, and now we see his empty chair sort of looming in the corner there. So very similar to the quadrant rule, but more extreme, is the far side and the short side rule. With these rules, you place your subject as far on one edge of the frame as possible and have them either look towards the short side of the frame with negative space behind, or put the negative space in front of them. This could be done if you really want to evoke the feeling of unbalance on purpose or to isolate the character. So you separate the subject from the rest of the world. My favorite example of this is in George Lucas's debut film THX 1138, which was made in 1971, shot by Albert Kine and David Myers, SOC. They used this type of framing quite a few times throughout the entire film, and it was really, really effective. The next rule is extremely powerful and also the simplest rule of them all. This is the center frame and also the full frame type of composition. So if you haven't guessed it by the name, you just put your subject in the middle of the frame. Done. It's a very easy way of telling the audience, hey, this is important, look at this. And if you add like a little Z-axis push or pull movement, you've created a very captivating shot that really commands the attention of the audience right to the middle of the frame, right to your subject. When it comes to the full frame composition, you're basically putting the subject so close that it fills the entire frame, and you give the audience nothing else to look at. So this is like really classic for close-ups of eyes and spaghetti westerns and things like that. And when you use this technique, you can basically largely ignore any other rule of composition because, well, the frame is completely filled with the subject. In the example from this shot, you can see that the flower almost fills the entire frame, but not quite, and it's almost centered, but not quite. And I want to show this particular shot in order to highlight the fact that composition isn't rocket science, and at the end of the day, these rules are just guidelines. So even though this isn't a perfect center frame or a perfect full frame composition, it's still a nice composition in and of itself, and it doesn't feel unbalanced in any way, even though it's not perfect. So at the end of the day, you can follow these rules, but also follow just what feels right to you. Another rule to think about is composing by using patterns. So whether it be a forest of trees, crowds of people, dozens of chairs in an auditorium, you can fill the entire frame with a repeating pattern and not really have to worry about any other compositional rule to make it feel well balanced, just like with a full frame composition. So you can see examples from this type of composition in wildlife photography, especially with like herds of animals and that type of stuff. Any Nat Geo or Blue Earth or Our Planet, any of those nature documentaries, you'll see pattern compositions all the time. So you can also see that this technique works really well when applied to aerial photography, because naturally when we look at things from above, especially buildings and trees and that type of stuff, you wind up getting a lot of patterns inherently. Alright, so one of the final rules to think about is the rule of leading lines. This technique can be actually combined with some of the other techniques to create an even more interesting composition. So it's not really a rule in and of itself, more a helpful tool. So a leading line is literally a physical line that's in your scene in the mise-en-scène that runs across any of the axes. So for instance, finding a leading line in the Z-axis can be a really good way of creating depth, something moving from the foreground all the way into the background, adding a lot of dimension to your shot. X-axis or Y-axis leading lines are really useful because they can separate subject matter in the frame by literally splitting the frame, and it also can provide a path for the eyes to follow, either side to side or up and down, creating a sense of movement by the movement of your eyes themselves. So examples of leading lines, like I said, can be anything that's physically in your shot. So it could be railroad tracks, streets, architectural lines on buildings, and whatever you can imagine. Leading lines could be straight or they could be curved, it doesn't really matter, and that allows you to get even more diversity to your shots. Okay, so the last thing we're going to talk about in terms of composition is headroom. You've probably heard this term before. Improper headroom is one of the biggest mistakes I see beginners make when it comes to composition. So it's a really easy rule, and it's just done by eye. So when composing a shot, you want to be aware of how much negative space is between the actor's head and the top of the frame. So too much negative space leaves the composition feeling unbalanced, feeling like a little bit too empty at the top, and too little negative space and it'll start feeling like the frame is encroaching on the actor, making it really claustrophobic. Now in both of those cases, you can actually use that type of composition on purpose to create some cool effects. So again, keep in mind, rules are meant to be broken, but it's definitely, headroom is really something you need to be aware of. Another thing to mention is if the composition is tighter on the actor, such as in a medium shot, it's acceptable to frame out the actor's forehead a little bit in order to keep their eyes on the third and use the rule of thirds as well. This is a really interesting example because the framing is so tight that you can't put the eyes on the third without clipping the mouth. And the mouth might be important because if someone is speaking, you know. So in this situation, you can actually largely ignore the rule of thirds because it falls under the full frame composition category. So remember, when something is completely filling the entire frame, you don't need to worry about any of the other rules. So I would say this image is a decent example of what good headroom is. So for this medium type of a shot, you want just a little bit of negative space above the actor's head. So yeah, that's basically it. Hope you guys enjoyed that episode. I hope you learned something, or I hope it was at least a refresher for some of you. If you did learn something and you did enjoy that video, then definitely be sure to check out my cinematography book. Link to it will be in the description. Again, thank you so much for watching, and I will catch you guys in the next one. Peace out.